The Chicago YIVO Society is a local affiliate of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. The mission of Chicago YIVO is to entertain and to educate the local community through subsidized lectures, such as today, music programs, and film screenings that reflect the rich heritage and the diversity of Jewish culture, and to ensure the future of Yiddish through language education. Please go to our website, chicagoyivo.org, for more information and to become a member or a donor. Your financial support helps us bring you programming such as we have today. And today in our program, we have Sheila Jelen. She is a professor of Jewish literature at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. Also, she is the author of a number of books and has edited many others. She is currently working on 2 books, one titled Israeli Salvage Poetics, and the second titled Testimonial Montage. Professor Jelen is also working on a project titled Images and Imaging, Menachem Kipnis's Photographs and Folk Stories. Please help me welcome Professor Sheila Jelen.
Thank you so very much. Before I begin, I wanted to thank Chicago YIVO for inviting me to give this talk. And especially I want to thank my father, Henry Jelen, who made this shidduch with David Skora, who has been working very hard on making this event happen. So thank you all. Thank you as well to Jake and to Fran for welcoming me so graciously and for introducing me so beautifully. I'm going to share my screen now. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Is it visible? Okay. So just before we started, my internet was a little unstable. So if for whatever reason I freeze up, don't be polite. Please let me know so we can troubleshoot. Okay, everybody? Don't be polite. Okay. So this talk is based on the 5th chapter of my recent book, Salvage Poetics, Post-Holocaust American Jewish Folk Ethnographies, which attempts to answer the following question. How do American Jews know what they think they know about pre-Holocaust East European Jewish life? In this lecture, I will focus.
It was that way, but I still can't hear them.
Well, then I'm sorry, that's not you. First of
Please
all,
mute
did you
yourself.
turn on this?
And I don't.
Everyone should mute themselves if they can. Okay. In this lecture, I will focus on the famous photographs of Roman Vishniac and his building of a bridge through his iconic photographs between the world of East European pre-Holocaust Jewish communities and American post-Holocaust ones. Among the most iconic photographs of Eastern European Jewish life taken in the pre-Holocaust period is the image of a bearded, elderly man with his hand to his head. His large bony nose divides his face in half, with one side shaded and one side illuminated. He wears a hat and looks directly out at the viewer. Printed in 1947 on the second to last page of Roman Vishniac's Polish Jews, with the caption, "Old Man, Carpathian Ruthenia." This photograph is followed by the final image in the book, that of a gravestone on which are carved the words, "Here is buried a wise, scholarly, innocent, righteous, God-fearing man who studied the words of the Torah day and night. He was a righteous innocent, Rabbi Baruch Yaakov, son of the distinguished Avram Shlomo. May his name be for a blessing." Above these words is an image of an open bookcase framed by the date of Rabbi Baruch Yaakov's death, the 13th of Av, 5589, or the 12th of August, 1829. Certainly, the gravestone is not to be understood as a monument to the man pictured on the page before him, but the implication is that this is the marker befitting a man of his ilk after he dies a dignified and timely death. The same image of the old man appears in Vishniac's later book, A Vanished World, which is from 1983, both on the cover of, as you see here, and as the third photograph, where it is presented by two captions. Beneath the photograph itself, we read, "An elder of the village, Vrichny Apsa, Carpathian Ruthenia, 1938. The second caption, which appears in a commentary on the photographs between the book's preface and the photographs themselves, reads, "It was 1938, but warmth and light were provided in the dwellings of the village of Upper Apsa by burning branches and logs. I remember so well the firelight illuminating the hands and face of this village elder, whose advice was sought by members of his community. How wise and comforting a man he seemed to be." In the progression of these three captions through the two volumes, we begin with a generic categorization of the image, identified only as an old man in Carpathian Ruthenia, with the additional implication provided by the photograph following it of mortality and dignity. The sequence of the two photographs in Polish Jews, therefore, offers an implied commentary that words do not provide. This remarkable economy of verbal language and reliance on a visual narrative for emotional and historical content in Polish Jews disappears 36 years later in A Vanished World. There, the caption directly beneath the same photograph of the old man identifies its subject as an elder of the village, specifying as well his location within Carpathian Ruthenia and the year the photograph was taken. In the third caption, appearing in the commentary on the photographs, Vishniac, it seems, wants to ethnographically contextualize the most distinctive aesthetic feature of the photograph, the play of light and darkness on the old man's face. Though Vishniac's deliberate uses of light in many of his photographs is typical of documentary photography, in this caption, Vishniac does not discuss the photograph's lighting as anything but a natural part of the environment, a function of the way homes were heated and lit in the village of Upper Apsa in Carpathian Ruthenia, 1938. The final statement in this caption introduces Vishniac's own sense of alienation from the scene he photographs. The word "seemed" indicates that although he wants to render judgment on the photograph's subject, describing him as how wise and comforting a man, he cannot do so definitively and must qualify his observation. What we read here in this final caption is both objectively descriptive and highly personal. This constellation of captions and implications for the same image highlights several crucial aspects of Roman Vishniac's iconic photographs of East European Jews taken on commission for the American Joint Distribution Committee from 1935 to 1938 to help raise consciousness in America and Western Europe of the impoverishment of East European Jews during the interwar period. First, Vishniac's photographs have had a rich and evocative afterlife, appearing again and again in exhibits, books, and other publications, from their first staging in an exhibit at the Joint Distribution Offices in 1938 until the present moment. Their social context differs in each publication and presentation, first appearing during the war, and finally reflecting a pre-war world destroyed for an audience without firsthand experience of that world. Second, over the course of the half-century in which Vishniac published these photos, they told an increasingly more complex, reflexive tale, moving from social documentary to autobiography. Before the war, as evident in the composition of the photographs themselves, as well as the goals of his commission by the JDC, Vishniac tells a story of Jewish poverty and the need for relief and immigration. After the war, Vishniac tells a story about himself, about the Holocaust and about pre-Holocaust East European Jewish culture. Maya Benton, who's was the curator of his exhibit at the International Center for Photography in New York, she edited a volume on the exhibit, and she said that one set of photographs could be interpreted and employed in so many ways is a testament to the power and influence of Vishniac's images. This talk explores the role of war photographs of East European Jews taken by Roman Vishniac from 1935 to 1938 in the construction of an American post-war sense of a lost world. What I hope to do is to take you through the evolution of Roman Vishniac's captioning of these photographs between 1947 and 1983 in order to approach a broader cultural understanding of the power of pre-Holocaust artifacts, such as Vishniac's photographs, in a post-Holocaust world. From a narrative perspective, the earlier book is exceedingly spare, with minimalist captions, as we have already seen, and the later book contains a layering of maximalist captions, wherein Vishniac inserts himself into the images as something of a native informant. In the nearly 40-year interval between the publication of the two books, through an increasingly rich and complex body of captions, Vishniac provides a fascinating example of what I would call the salvage poetics which often arise out of pre-Holocaust aesthetic works in the post-Holocaust era. What are salvage poetics? Salvage poetics are a series of framing devices wherein primary cultural materials in the form of text or image are mediated, translated, explicated, personalized, and or valorized in an effort to create an accessible description of a lost culture. Salvage poetics represent a streamlining of popular desire on the part of an audience and specialized linguistic and cultural knowledge on the part of authors who seek to educate that audience. A variation on salvage poetics, for example, is readily identifiable in the 1971 Hollywood production of Fiddler on the Roof, wherein a religious Yiddish-speaking population in Eastern Europe before the war is presented to an audience with only one Yiddish word, l'chaim, and a general overview of two religious rituals, the Sabbath and a wedding. Based on the Yiddish stories of Shalom Aleichem, which is, as we know, the pseudonym of Shalom Rabinovich, who lived from 1859 to 1916, Fiddler on the Roof also articulates an important element of salvage poetics in that it appoints a literary text, which is the Tevye the Milkman stories, which were published between 1894 and 1914, as the basis for its bridge to an American public, translating it from Yiddish to English, from text to cinema, and even from a Russian sensibility to an American one. Salvage poetics, therefore, as they are articulated in Fiddler, can be summed up in the following way. First, they fulfill a popular desire to salvage a dead or dying world. Second, they base themselves on cultural artifacts, in this case, literary ones, which are consciously and actively glossed, translated, and rendered accessible or relatable by a transformative mediation of some variety or another. Indeed, as I hope to explore together with you, Roman Vishniac, in his presentation of his own increasingly iconic photographs of pre-Holocaust East European Jews in the post-Holocaust era, becomes invested in presenting himself as a means of channeling a lost culture. Tracing the development of the captions across the two publications and focusing specifically on the captions in A Vanished World from a literary perspective provides a fascinating insight into the ways in which Vishniac sought to construct a particular kind of narrative in America in the decades after the Holocaust. His increased emphasis on verbal storytelling to supplement the photographs and the personal nature of many of these stories reveal Vishniac's consciousness of the importance of telling the story of a lost culture through the story of a living self, bringing together a salvage impulse with an autobiographical one. While we know that the original photographs were commissioned for the Joint Distribution Committee for documentary purposes, the particular documentary mission of these photographs shifted from raising consciousness of a pressing economic need among East European Jews in the pre-Holocaust period to representation of a vanished world after the Holocaust. This took place not only because of the war's intervention, but also with the help of the unique narrative that Vishniac develops in successive presentations of the same photographs. Unlike other well-known photographers from the pre-Holocaust era, such as Alter Katzizna and Menachem Kipnis, Vishniac survived the war and was able to recast his photographs in response to the needs of a post-Holocaust American audience. In doing so, he places himself into the photographs, first as a participant observer and finally as a native informant, claiming the world represented in the photographs as his own. And just a word about Katzizna and Kipnis. Katzizna died in a massacre outside of Vilna early on in the war, and Kipnis died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Having been detained in France in 1939 under unknown circumstances, but released 1 month later, Vishniac, his first wife Luda, and his 2 children, Wolf and Mara, who had temporarily sought refuge in Sweden, met in Libsyn and set sail for New York in December 1940. Although Elie Wiesel predicts in his foreword to A Vanished World that Vishniac will write about his experience in war-torn Europe, someday, he says, he will tell us how he fooled the Gestapo and the informers and death. Vishniac never does. Nonetheless, his captions and the narrative that he crafts out of his iconic photographs mark an impulse to tell not only the story of the murdered subjects of his photographs, but also of his own experience as witness to a vanished world. Despite the fact that the intensely personal tenor of many of his later captions would indicate otherwise, Roman Vishniac's photographs are commonly used as generic illustrations for traditional Jewish life. In a 2010 book on the visual culture of Chabad, for example, Maya Balakirsky-Katz begins her discussion of the Hasidic image with an allusion to Vishniac's A Vanished World. Perhaps more than any other images purporting to represent pre-war Jewish life, she says, photographer Roman Vishniac's work for Jewish relief organizations in the 1930s, published under the telling title A Vanished World, supplied American audiences with their quintessential images of East European Hasidim. In countless films, photo anthologies, and introductions, Vishniac's photographs have served as a quick and easy gateway into the world of pre-Holocaust East European Jewish life. Yet the story that Vishniac's books tell is a very different one about his own position as an assimilated Russian Jew exiled to Berlin after the Russian Revolution. Roman Vishniac's father, Solomon, one of the few Jews given the right to live and work in Moscow, became one of Russia's leading manufacturers of umbrellas. The consequent luxury and ease that characterized Vishniac's early life as a Jewish boy growing up in an assimilated family in Moscow was a far cry from the life of most Jews in Russia. Yet, because most Jews were not permitted to live or work in Moscow, the only place where, by most accounts, a decent living could be had, Solomon Vishniac ended up sheltering many students in flight from the law who were seeking to matriculate at Russian universities despite restrictive admissions quotas on Jews. Vishniac, in a 1955 interview with The New Yorker, recalls them in the following way. They had a special kind of face, those people, a special kind of whisper, and a special kind of footstep. They were like hunted animals, a terrible thing to be. I can never forget that. As a Russian Jewish émigré between the 2 world wars, Vishniac can be counted among the multitudes of East European Jews flooding into Germany, and particularly Berlin, during that period. Germany, sharing a border with Eastern Europe, experienced during the 19th century a dramatic rise in East European Jewish immigration as Jews flooded west. East European Jews bordering Germany and constantly infiltrating her space and consciousness became the living reminder to German Jewry of the traditional Jewish culture it had recently rejected. The East European Jew was the bad memory of German Jewry come alive and an ever-present threat to assimilationist aspirations. Jacob Fromer, in his introduction to Solomon Maimon's autobiography, described the Jewish ghetto in Berlin as a kind of anthropological curiosity. Whoever desires to experience an ethnological sensation need not venture to the far corners of the world. For that, a day's journey from Berlin will suffice. One need only cross the Russian border to find an almost unknown human type full of mystery and wonder. The anthropological fascination with East European Jews that grew out of this German Jewish context translated itself during the interwar and the Weimar years into a movement that has been called the cult of the Ostjude. This movement has generally been characterized as a fetishization and essentialization of the East European Jew and East European Jewish experience by a generation of German Jewish youth who had been born into German Jewish Bildung, or culture, with all its attendant legacies and privileges. The mostly assimilated and spiritually disaffected generation of the cult was largely secure financially, but despite their embrace of the German values of Bildung, which they had come to represent and to embody for non-Jewish Germans, anti-Semitism was on the rise. Indeed, given Vishniac's presence among a large group of privileged refugees from Russia living in the Wilmersdorf community on the edge of Charlottenburg, affectionately called Charlottengrad, in recognition of its Slavic settlers, I would be hard-pressed to argue that Vishniac was identifiable in any significant way with the Eastern Jews who were the focus of the cult of the Ostjuden. After his arrival in America, however, when the events of the Holocaust were coming to light, and he was able to reflect back on the documentary value of the photographs beyond their contribution to the JDC's work on behalf of East European Jewish refugees, Vishniac did come to identify himself as an East European Jew. His preface to A Vanished World provides us with an articulation of this. He writes, "From earliest childhood, my main interest was my ancestors. My grandfather Wolf and my parents told me about the activities of my forefathers following the establishment of the Pale of Settlement by the pseudo-liberal Tsarina Catherine II. They told me of the restrictions against Jews and how Nicholas I forced the conscription of Jewish boys with the intention of converting them to Christianity. My great-grandparents bought these child soldiers from the Russian officers for the weekends and taught them how to remain Jews. By doing so, my great-grandparents were risking persecution and exile to Siberia, but they persisted. My own activities began when I was 18, early in the First World War. The Jews of the Pale who resided in the battle zone were declared German spies and were forcibly transported to the Russian interior in cattle cars, without food or water and without any provision for housing once they arrived. This was but a prelude to what was to come 2 decades later. I was living in Germany in the 30s, and I knew that Hitler had made it his mission to exterminate all Jews, especially the children and the women who could bear children in the future. I was unable to save my people, only their memory." In this statement, Vishniac narrates his place as a Russian, the descendant of pious Jews, a witness to the destruction of Jews in World War I, and a prophet of future destruction in World War II. The preface is accompanied by a portrait of his grandfather, Wolf Vishniac, sporting a long white beard and traditional rabbinic garb, a square black yarmulke, and a gabardine. Roman Vishniac, arriving in Berlin in 1920, had more in common with the native German Jewish population from the standpoint of his education and level of assimilation than with the East European Jewish masses flooding into Germany. In 1971, Vishniac was one of several photographers featured in a series called The Concerned Photographer and co-edited by Cornell Kappa and Michael Edelson. Vishniac's familiar selection of JDC photographs are interspersed there with examples from his photomicroscopy, a photographic technique using polarized light developed by Vishniac in order to capture the beauty of microorganisms in their minutest details without disturbing them or their natural habitat. A photo representing the surface of his own skin is magnified 200 times, and a photograph of anthrax bacillus is magnified 2,250 times. I think this is the anthrax photograph. Facing the anthrax bacillus is a familiar photo of a grandfather and granddaughter engaged in conversation, which is included in both Polish Jews and A Vanished World. Preceding the image of the skin is a famous image of a little girl stuck in bed all winter for lack of shoes, with the flowers that her father painted for her to look at on the wall behind her. The fact that a magnification of his own skin appears beside his East European subjects may, not too subtly, return us to our contention that Vishniac's photographic work with East European Jewry before the war was, to a large extent, an exploration of his own East European origins within a West European exile. He was, in other words, exploring what he presents as his own history, identifying himself with the subjects of his photographs, even while maintaining a comfortable distance from them. In truth, as we have discussed, Vishniac was a far cry from the type of Ostjude prevalent in Germany during the interwar period, and yet throughout his commentary on the photographs in A Vanished World, he continuously presents himself as one of his subjects, through intimate encounters with them narrated in his captions. In image 20 of A Vanished World, Vishniac gives us a background on Jewish Poland prior to the war and begins a thread on Vishniac's place within the photographed landscape. He writes, in the caption, an economic boycott of Poland's 3.5 million Jews occurred in the late 1930s. The worried couple featured in this photograph were apparently victims of this boycott. Vishniac explains in his supplemental captions prior to the appearance of all the photographs, he says, after I took this picture of the obviously worried couple, I followed them, introduced myself, and inquired about their problem. Why was I there at that moment? This parenthetical reflection, why was I there at that moment, serves as an interesting introduction to the role he will cast himself in throughout his commentary. And if, for those of you who are familiar with the book, these are pictures of porters. This is a guy named Nat. I can't remember his last name right now, but there's a picture of him, and there's a picture of another porter, and this is a picture of the different licenses that the porters had to use in order to work as porters. In his commentary on these images of porters, Vishniac talks about how the boycott forced many Jews into that occupation. And he writes, even though their task was menial and their life hard, they never forgot their traditions and their heritage. In his large leap from his own desire to grasp the contemporary experience of the Jewish porters to his assertion about their loyalty to Jewish tradition, Vishniac positions himself as someone familiar with their religious beliefs and their practices, and not just an outsider viewing what appears to be their economic distress. Again, emphasizing his personal connection to a photograph, Vishniac, in a later comment, describes an intimate glimpse into the sleeping quarters of 26 families living in a basement apartment. He says, I learned about the heroic endurance of my brethren. In his images of Nat Gutman and his family, we see the meager porter's meal of dry bread that Gutman and his wife shared with Vishniac. And then this is his wife, Nat Gutman's wife, who we don't know her name. A rhetoric of participation, of sharing, of commiseration, creates an impression that Vishniac was not just photographing these subjects, but suffering with them. After the war in 1947, Vishniac returned to Europe on a final JDC commission along with a United Jewish Appeal trip and a forward assignment in order to document the lives of Jewish refugees and Jews in displaced person camps. In captions written posthumously by employees of the ICP archive, the International Center for Photography, these images are presented as part of a narrative of return. While he himself did not author these captions, nor did he publish these photographs during his lifetime, the narrative of return presented here is a natural extension of the narrative of return implied in the photographic collections he himself created. While what empowered Vishniac to take these pictures in the first place was his status as an outsider with the means and mobility to document the life of a people stymied by poverty and politics, he becomes an insider, returning to the place where the photographs were taken. His act of having photographed them positions him after the war as one of them, a survivor plucked from their ranks. What are the implications of this dynamic change in his status? Vishniac struggles to represent this world from every perspective, that of an insider, that of an outsider, that of someone who was there with them when they had not yet been murdered, and that of someone who survived the killing machine in order to tell the tale of their death. To sum up, Roman Vishniac, a Russian Jew, found himself in Berlin in the 1930s, having left a few years after the Russian Revolution and following his wealthy industrialist Jewish family who escaped during the upheaval. He was commissioned to take photographs by the Joint Distribution Committee as part of a campaign to raise consciousness about Jewish poverty in Eastern Europe during the interwar period and to solicit donations to aid in their immigration to the United States. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Vishniac sought to insert himself through his narratives into the photographs that came increasingly to identify the world of European Jews over the next several decades. The simultaneous forces of assimilation and dissimilation, of the valorization and demonization of characteristic of German responses to East European Jewish immigration during the period between the two world wars all find their way into the continuing story of Vishniac's personal journey through the landscapes and lives he photographed in the years immediately before the Holocaust. Vishniac's captions and narratives illuminate a critical stage in the creation of a portrait of pre-Holocaust East European Jewish life in the post-Holocaust period. They tell the story of a particular brand of salvage poetics, rooted in documentary, cultivated in a rejection of Jewish assimilation, and coming to full fruition in a post-cataclysmic moment that sought an easily accessible panorama of a vanished world in the construction of a new American Jewish post-Holocaust ethnic reality. And that's where I conclude my formal remarks.
Sheila has offered to answer questions. Let me lead, this is Jake Morowitz again. Let me lead with a question. Where do these photographs reside? And have they all been published someplace?
That's a good question. Do you want me to stop my share or keep the share going?
You can stop the share.
Okay. Okay. So the photographs reside at the International Center for Photography in New York.
Whoops.
Sorry, did you hear anything I said? I muted myself accidentally.
Try it again.
Okay, let me start again. So the photographs reside in the International Center of Photography in New York City, which I referred to a couple of times in the course of the talk. His literary executor is his grandson, and the woman I quoted, Maya Benton, is in charge of the archive. So when I was writing this chapter for my book, I had to go to Maya Benton in order to ask for permission for certain photographs to publish along with my discussion, and she had to send my chapter to the
Whoops, you
for
froze
his
it.
approval.
You're good.
Am I okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So I had to send my chapter to the grandson for him to approve it. And the reason they're so careful about this is because there's a great division between the stories that he tells about the photographs and the historical truth of the photographs. So the grandson is a historian, and he finds it very disturbing that his grandfather told all kinds of stories that were not true. Like, for example, he did tell the New Yorker in the article that I quoted from 1955 that he finished medical school when he didn't. And there were like a lot of other examples of this, actually. And so they want to make sure that anyone who publishes on Roman Vishniac doesn't reproduce these falsehoods as historical fact. So that was an interesting interlude for me, because I'm not a historian, I'm a literature scholar. And so for me, what's interesting is not whether his stories are historically correct, but how he crafts these stories and why he crafts them the way he does, right? So one other example of this, which is very interesting, which I didn't include in this talk, but is in the book, is that Roman Vishniac had a picture of a carriage driver in his collection. And the caption that he wrote is basically a Chelm story, right? So he tells the story of how he was visiting his grandfather's hometown, and he hired a carriage driver to take him there so he could take some pictures. And then he asked the carriage driver to come back 3 days later in order to pick him up. And so 3 days later, the carriage driver comes back and picks him up, and he basically charges him for 3 days worth of his services. And Vishniac says, well, why did you charge me for the intervening days? You know, I didn't need you in those days. I told you to come back 3 days later. And he said, so much happened in those 3 days you can't even imagine. My wife got sick. My child died. I had to pay for the burial, etc. And it's a Chelm story. Okay. But he doesn't frame it as a Chelm story. He doesn't say, this carriage driver reminded me of this Chelm story, so I took this picture and here's the story. He doesn't say that, right? He just tells the Chelm story as if it happened to him. And that is, I think, something that drove his grandson bananas, right? But that I find very interesting as a literature scholar, you know, how he incorporated the Chelm story as a kind of artifact, right? Just like Fiddler on the Roof, as I said, incorporated the Tevye stories as a kind of artifact into itself in order to communicate this culture to American Jews, right? Similarly, Roman Vishniac incorporated a Chelm story as a kind of artifact of East European Jewish literature into his narration of these photographs. So to answer your question more directly, the photographs are all at the ICP, and I don't think they've all been published. There was, as I mentioned, an exhibit that I think has recently stopped, but it was for a decade, it was out there traveling around, which was called Roman Vishniac Revisited, which tried to highlight some of his other photographs, some of the non-iconic ones, like the ones of the Berlin Zoo, or the ones of, there were lots of pictures of post-war youth building sort of kibbutzim in the Netherlands. So there are lots of those pictures, which, you know, haven't really been published. He also has a lot of photographs of Chinatown in New York, a lot of photomicroscopy, which I talked about earlier. And so you can see a lot of these photographs in the catalog for the exhibit, which is a hefty book with lots of really interesting essays about these different groups of photographs that no one knows about.
Let me ask you another question. You mentioned two other photographers, Kipnis, and I forget the other person's name. Have those photographs been used post-Holocaust, and have they been used in a way to explain the Holocaust to the modern world?
Right. So the two photographers that you are mentioning are Alter Katzizna and Menachem Kipnis. So Alter Katzizna, his daughter survived the war, and at the end of her life, she collaborated with Marek Webb of YIVO to put together a book of his photographs, and they called it Poilin. And it's one of the most beautiful books you'll ever see. I mean, his photographs were extraordinarily beautiful. In fact, two of my book covers are photographs by Alter Katzizna. I am just so drawn to his photographs. The first one is of a girl's cheder. That was my first book about a woman, a Hebrew woman writer. And then the second one for Salvage Poetics was a photograph that he took of a grave digger teaching his grandson Hebrew, with the grandmother looking on. It's a beautiful photograph of a family. So that's been published. And, you know, all of the photographs that exist of Alter Katzizna and Menachem Kipnis exist only because they were stringers for the Forverts. So they sent their photographs to New York for this special rotogravure section that the Forverts had for many years. And they had a special feature called like Images from the Old Country. And Vishniac's photographs also appeared there. Katzizna's photographs appeared there, and Kipnis's, among others. So what we have of their oeuvre is from the fact that they sent their stuff to New York. And you know, Alter Katzizna had a photography studio in Warsaw, and there were, you know, hundreds of thousands of pictures that we, you know, lost in the war. So, and then Kipnis is an interesting story, because when I first started researching this years and years ago, I was pregnant with my 12-year-old daughter, so it was that long ago, I just remember. I was sitting in the YIVO archive in New York, and I'm not sure who it was, but one of the archivists came up to me and saw that I was looking through the photographs from the rotogravure section, and said to me, you know, we have all these photographs of Menachem Kipnis, and no one has ever done a book on him. Like Katzizna's granddaughter or daughter did with Marek Webb for Katzizna's. Would you like to do something like that? And I said, I really would, but not yet. I have other things to do first. So actually, Fran mentioned in my introduction that is a book that I am going to be working on. As soon as I finish my current book, Testimonial Montage, I'm turning to that book. I've already written a chapter of that book. And my hope is to publish his photographs alongside some scholarly discussion, but mostly it's going to be a book of photographs.
I've allowed people to unmute themselves. I don't want to be the only person that's asking questions.
Looks like Rivka has a question.
Rivka, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm in Montreal, and we had the great fortune a long time ago to have an exhibit of Vishniac's photographs, and he himself came to speak. So we had time to talk to him. So what I'm going to ask, is not on him, but I think, and for people like my parents who came after the war, and other survivors who came from the big city, who came from fairly sophisticated backgrounds, very secular, very political, cultural, and everything. The photographs of Eastern Europe, which only portrayed, you know, shtetl people and very poor people, were what people were carrying, the people who greeted them and who met them. So they were met as if that's who they were. And they resented or found difficult this idea that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with people from a shtetl, that's not the point, but that there was, without asking them who they were, there was this idea that that's who they must be, and they were treated as somebody who needed to be shown how to flush the toilet. So, and then what was really wonderful was the book and then the film that Josh Waletsky did called Image Before My Eyes, which I highly recommend to anyone in this room who has not seen that film. I highly recommend watching it, because you get that fuller picture of interwar Poland and the sophistication and the diversity of experience and of organization, and etc. But do you find that those kinds of pictures like did some shall we say, negative, they had some negative influence on how people were greeted when they came to America?
Absolutely. I was going to actually mention Image Before My Eyes before you did, so I'm glad you turned our attention to that. So as I said, you know, these photographs were the famous Vishniac photographs were first taken on commission in order to illustrate poverty. They were supposed to document poverty. And then over time, they became representative of an entire world. And how did that happen? What I was trying to argue was it happened because he made it happen through his captions and through his narrative and through subsequent publications. So the two publications that I've focused on are not the only publications of Vishniac's photographs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a volume called Children of a Vanished World, which, you know, takes his photographs of children and puts them together. And there are several other publications that he was responsible for that continue to encourage this view, this worldview. And in their excellent introduction to Image Before My Eyes, Barbara Kirsch-Black Gimblett I don't know why my computer keeps muting itself, but in their excellent introduction to Image Before My Eyes, Barbara Kirsch-Black Gimblett and Lucian Dobrzycki both, you know, they write about how their plan for this book, as you said, Rivka, was to illuminate the modernity of East European Jewishness and the cosmopolitan nature of so much. And, you know, my original scholarly work was on Hebrew literature of the turn of the 20th century, which basically is about those Jews who left the shtetl and went to university or tried to get into university throughout Eastern Europe, and were modern and were secular and knew how to flush a toilet. And so, you know, that is really the story of Jewish modernity, right? Is that, you know, in the 19th century, Jews started, like, you know, cutting off their payas and sticking, you know, Tolstoy into their Talmuds and reading that when they were supposed to be learning Torah, right? And so the idea that the world before the Holocaust was backward or was all impoverished is really a function, I think, of the Holocaust itself. I think people needed to see them that way. But photographs like Vishniac's and the narratives that surrounded them facilitated that, for sure.
Does somebody else have a question?
Yeah, it looks like Jan Lisa Hutner has a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Jake. Hi, Fran. So many beloved faces. Sheila, I live in Brooklyn now, but I was a member of Chicago YIVO for wonderful years and have done a lot of research, as some people know, on Fiddler on the Roof. So there's a new documentary that's just released this week in Chicago called Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen, which is really a love letter to Norman Jewison. And it opened here at the Angelica in New York 2 weeks ago, and it was my honor to do 2 Q&As at the Angelica. So the big point is made in this documentary about Norman Jewison's commitment to authenticity and how much he used the Roman Vishniac photos as the model for what he wanted to show in Fiddler on the Roof, which was, well, you know, I don't want to say too much about my feelings about that, except to say that Fiddler on the Roof is, of course, set in 1905, and the pictures that he's showing, which I've had the Vishniac books for, you know, several decades myself, are as you say, from the 30s. So has anybody ever tracked this element of it? I mean, again, the documentary is beautiful, and I highly recommend it because it is a love letter to Norman Jewison, and he does deserve a love letter because he did something, and yet the residual effects on our view of Fiddler on the Roof and the huge gap between what Jerome Robbins did on stage and what Norman Jewison then did on the screen. Has anybody ever tracked this Vishniac Jewison fiddler connection in any detail?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Actually, in the introduction to my book, Salvage Poetics, I talk about how Jewison, and also, who's the choreographer of the 71 version? I'm totally blanking on his name right now.
Well, the assistant choreographer was Sammy Dallas Bass, who in fact died just this week. I'm not remembering who the primary choreographer was. I can look it up right now.
Yeah, if you don't mind. But anyway, there's this really amazing photograph. So first of all, he talked a lot about the influence of Roman Vishniac photographs, on his production of Fiddler on the Roof. And interestingly, I have this one image of him in his office with a photograph behind him that actually wasn't a Roman Vishniac photograph, but I think it was a Cornell Kappa photograph of a Rebbe and a boy, a Hasidic Rebbe and his student.
Tommy Abbott. Tommy Abbott was the choreographer. Did you mean the cinematographer? Is that who you're talking about?
Actually, not the choreographer, the director, who was a choreographer, though. He was a famous choreographer, but he directed. I don't have my copy of the book.
Okay,
here.
that's okay.
Anyway, but so there's a photograph of him with this photograph behind him, which is taken in New York in the 1950s. And he talks about how this photograph, among others, including the Roman Vishniac photographs, affected his ability to direct this film. And it was just really interesting to me because what we are seeing then is this kind of recreation of Eastern Europe in New York that is serving as the model for this ethnographic Hollywood film about East European Jews. It's this very big hodgepodge. And also he talks about how he gave gifts to everyone who worked on he gave gifts to everyone who worked on this film, and what he gave them was Roman Vishniac's book.
Yeah, it's very clear in the documentary, and very different than the notes that Jerome Robbins wrote.
Jerome Robbins, that's the one.
No, but I mean, he had them, but he also, anyway, but I don't, oh, you're talking about
Jerome Robbins.
Anyway, I just put the link into IMDb if people want to see it of the whole cast and crew. I do, as I say, highly recommend the documentary. It's really beautifully done. But what you're telling us is that there's fact and then there's mythology.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think Elisa Eisenman wants to say something. Go ahead, Elisa.
Yes, thank you. I had the good fortune of meeting Roman Vishniac in New York at the ICP and buying his book, Vanished World, right then and there, which he autographed. And I was really taken with his passion for his work. He told us stories that made me believe that he put his life at risk taking some of those photographs, that he had taken them during the time of the rise of Nazism, and some of them in Germany. And they were like, as if he was a spy, as if he was taking these pictures to preserve the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe. Now that you're telling me that he is sometimes fabricating stories, I'm curious to know if what he told us was his, what he wanted us to believe. So maybe you can throw some light on that. And I'm fascinated by what you have been telling us, because he left an indelible impression on me.
Mhm.
And I look at his book all the time. It's in my living room, right? Very prominent place.
So
Jan, or this is Kitty in Chicago. And what is the name
Could
of
you
the
let
guy?
Sheila respond, please, first, Kitty?
Yes, could Sheila respond to my question?
so about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, there was a piece in the New York Times in the Sunday magazine. I remember the author's first name, but I don't remember her last name. Her first name was Alana, Alana. I can look it up. She basically wrote about that very issue, which is, Roman Vishniac claimed to have been in great danger while he was taking these photographs, and he claimed to sometimes be using a hidden camera.
Alana Newhouse. Alana Newhouse.
Alana Newhouse. Thank you. Yeah, that's who it is. Yeah. And she uses two photographs that were juxtaposed in a vanished world to illustrate how his stories about the photographs, taking the photographs, are not really true. Because in one photograph, there's a picture of a boy looking around a corner, and in another, there's a picture of a man looking out of a window. And the caption that he includes is, this child is warning his father about some, marauder, some pogrom chick coming. And so he's basically creating this narrative about this dangerous situation that he himself is a witness to, and he himself is present for. But if you look at the negatives, it's clear that they were taken on different rolls of film in different places at different times. So this story that he's pieced together from these two pictures, and which he places himself into as a witness, it's made up, right? So, I'm not, again, as I said before, I'm not a historian. It's not my job to verify facts, right? But again, I think that the idea that he was compelled to tell these stories is very much a testament to how valuable he knew these photographs would be in the future. And he came to that understanding over time, right? This is a story that developed over time. And so so as I said, the first exhibition of his photographs was in 1944 at YIVO, actually. And then in 1947, Polish Jews was published, and then 1983, A Vanished World was published, and then subsequent books were published. And in each appearance of these photographs, he found more and more to tell and to make up, right? So there's a famous photograph of a rabbi in his study, in his base medrash. And in the earlier publications, it just says, I don't know who this is, but here's this rabbi in his base medrash. And then later on, he says, this was Rabbi blah, blah, blah. He was killed in such and such a camp, and it could be that he'd found out information. Sometimes people see photographs and say, oh, I know that person. I know, if you go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and you look up some of their archived testimonies, there's this little sidebar and it says, do you recognize anyone from this testimony? You know what I mean? Like, they're still asking. People might still come forward and say, I know what happened to him. So it's entirely possible that he did figure out what happened to this rabbi, but it's unlikely, I think, that he genuinely did.
Richard Suckles has been very patient. You want to unmute yourself? Richard?
Yeah, yes. I've read Ansky, and he was a journalist as opposed to a photographer. Did he have any contact with any of these photographers when he was going through? It was actually during World War I, and I read just a book of his just recently about his travels through that and collecting money and going to different places. Did he have any contact with any of these photographers, or did he take any photographs himself?
Yeah, so Ansky's ethnographic mission through the Pale of Settlement, which took place from 1912 to 1914, did have a cadre of photographers accompanying it. So there's actually a book that was published recently called Photographing the Jewish
Photographing the Jewish Nation. I put it in
yes,
the,
that's exactly right. It's called Photographing the Jewish Nation. And these are the photographs that were taken alongside the Ansky expedition. So I don't think he necessarily had contact with Kipnis or Katsizna. He was also, they were later, right? They were like a generation or two later, or a decade or two later. But there were a number of very talented photographers who did take pictures with him as he went around exploring these different communities and recording their music and recording their folk stories, etc.
Okay.
A
But
woman
that
from
music-
Chicago wanted to ask a question.
Okay.
Did I
No, I
interrupt?
just wanted to ask the title of that book.
No, I asked for the title of that documentary, but Jan put it in the chat.
Okay.
Put in a bunch of
Thank you.
things, yeah.
Okay,
So it's called Photographing the Jewish Nation for
Mm.
Richard.
The publisher or the year or anything about it, other than that?
Well, not off the top of my head.
I'll Google it. I'll Google
Yeah,
it.
you'll find it. It's called Photographing the Jewish Nation.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Harvey Nabulski, you put something in the chat about another book that was published. Do you want to share that?
yeah, that is the book that we've just been chatting about. It's called
Oh.
Photographing the Jewish Nation. And so I put the name and so you can find it on Amazon. It just recently got sold out of Amazon. There's a soft cover version that's $35, but it's on eBay. And there's a hardcover version that sells for $125. But the pictures are lovely. It's done on really nice paper with a nice cover. I mean, a nice cover because it's durable enough in the soft cover. So it's if you can get it, it's $35 is the list price.
Thank you.
I'm putting into the chat the name of the Alter Katzizna book that you should look for as well, because that's also a very beautiful book. And I'm also just going to put into the chat the title of my book.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you please, who published your books that have been published?
It's Wayne State University Press. And I'll just put it in here. Okay.
It is past time. If there is no other pressing questions, I'm going to thank you, Sheila, very much. This was fascinating and thought-provoking for me. I hope it was also fascinating and thought-provoking to the 60-something people, I think closer to 70 people that joined us. So thank you very much. And I just want to tell you all that YIVO has phenomenal archives, National YIVO. It also has an encyclopedia online and the Ed Blank thing online. And the FOVETS also has amazing archives. They still exist. I'm sure you know that as well, Sheila.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you one and all.
Thank you all for such wonderful questions and for coming and listening so attentively. It's just wonderful to share this work with such an interested group. So thank you.
And thank you all. And don't forget Chicago YIVO.